Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for what I believe it's a very important and fascinating discussions on how we approach democracy promotion in the Middle East. I'm thrilled today to discuss our recent policy report on democracy with my colleague Henry, the trust differential framework, which emerged from a question that really has troubled policymakers since the 2011 Arab Springs on why did the Arab Spring catch us by surprise? Why we did not predict this will happen, so what did we miss in our analysis? And so more specifically, why did countries with vibrant civil society and regular elections, the very markers that we use to kind of assess democracy promotions, experience revolutionary upheaval rather than stability? My name is Dania Arayssi. I am a non-resident senior fellow at the New Lines Institute. I am also an assistant adjunct professor at Georgetown University and about to defend my dissertation next week. Also get my PhD in political science at the University of Colorado Boulder. I'm joined here with my colleague Henry Rogers, a student fellow at the New Lines Institute in the Middle East Center. Henry has a bachelor degree in international affairs and he's earning a master's in strategy and policy from the New Lines Institute. So this past summer, Henry and I developed what we call the trust differential framework using Arab Barometer data from both before and after the Arab Spring. And what we found is that it's not just about whether people trust their government or civil society. It's more about who do they trust, what kind of government institution do they trust, and why there is. And so when citizens trust civil society organizations but deeply distrust government institutions like the police or the judiciary, this creates conditions for protest and instability rather than democratic consolidation. So when you have trust in government, when you have trust in civil society, or you have trust in and you distrust the government, this kind of variations in trust create conditions for protest and instability rather than democratic consolidations. And so this is kind of what we're talking about. It's kind of understanding why we have those gaps in trust in political institutions and what does these gaps tell us on what's going on inside the political systems. And can we use these gaps to predict if we're going to have a regime uprising, if we're going to have a regime instability? And so our analysis really focused on Lebanon, Tunisia, and Egypt, kind of trying to study these gaps in trust. And we kind of use this analysis to use it as an early indicator on what can we do in those economies and what is a kind of democracy promotion policy we can suggest for policymakers. And so today I'm particularly honored to discuss these findings with Professor Dean Amaney Jamal, whose groundbreaking works, we all know about her work on political participation, civic engagement, and institutions in the Arab Spring and in the Arab world has fundamentally shaped how we study these questions and how we understand these dynamics. It's my great honor to welcome Dean Amaney Jamal to this important conversations. Thank you so much for joining us. Dean Jamal serves as the Deans of the Princeton Schools of Public and International Affairs and the Edward Stanford Professor of Politics at Princeton University. Dean Jamal is one of the prominent scholars on political behavior, civic engagements, and democratization in the Middle East and North Africa. Dr. Jamal is also the co-principal investigator of the Arab Barometer, that is the largest source of public opinion data in the Arab world. Dean Jamal is also recognized for numerous scholarly work. She's a Carnegie School Scholar, an Andrew Carnegie Fellow, and has received multiple awards for both her research excellence and her contributions to understanding the Middle East and the very dynamic issues that we study in the Middle East. Her work has appeared in the most prestigious academic journals, as well as major policy publications and media outlets. Dean Jamal, it's an absolute privilege, and we are honored to have you here with us today. Thank you so much. Your insights on our report, on our analysis is very important, and we really appreciate your time being with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dania, for that very generous introduction. It's such an honor to be with you today and to be commenting on your brilliant report with Henry, and I look forward to the discussion.
I'm going to start the conversation with Henry, first of all.
Yes, I'd love to start us off on the subject of rethinking democracy promotion. Given the mixed results and in some cases outright failures of US democracy promotion efforts over the past 2 decades in the Middle East, from Iraq to Egypt to Tunisia, do you think the fundamental approach needs to be reconsidered, or is it more about refining implementation? What lessons from the Arab Barometer data should be shaping how the international community thinks about supporting democratic development in the region?
Right. So this is a great question, Henry, and like I guess this topic encompasses both my single authored books on the Middle East and democratic sort of engagement and promotion, from barriers to democracy to of empires and citizens. Right. So if we look at the arc of that trajectory, I think it's really important for us to still ask the question, right? To what extent was democracy a strategically invested sort of outcome in terms of U.S. foreign policy in the region to begin with, right? And what type of democracy would have been suitable to not only the U.S. but to Western geostrategic interests, given the realities on the ground, right? So in other words, when we talk about democracy promotion, are we really talking about, quote unquote, an institutional democracy or procedural democracy where you have elections, then you have an electoral government that reflects the wishes of the people, that is representative, and where its primary sort of commitments are to their constituents? So that's one definition of democracy. And let's just put that on the side. The other sort of commitment to democracy is, no, it's not only about these procedural requirements, right? You need to have the underlying norms and values of democracy, or what is deemed as, quote unquote, the desired democratic outcome. And this is where it's always been tricky with U.S. democracy promotion packages, because it's never been clear what the desired or the ideal democratic prototype is in the context of the Middle East. And remember, we're dealing with a foreign policy, or at least inputs into foreign policy sometimes that are really infused with still sort of like archaic understandings of Islam and Muslims and Arab societies, right? There's a deep suspicion still that pervades a lot of the democracy promotion work being done by Western democracies as it relates to the Middle East. So if you're operating from this prism of fear, misunderstanding, Islamophobia, if you may, is then the democracy project one that is designed to transform the citizens of the region, to make them, quote unquote, more suitable for a Western democratic project that still feeds into the geostrategic interest of the United States and Western democracies? So I want to break that down, if you may. I'm going to try to be brief, right? And this is work that we've tackled. I mean, it's not a surprise when we say sometimes U.S. strategic and Western strategic interests don't necessarily align with the well-being of Arab citizens and the desires of Arab citizens in the region. And, you know, we don't need to get into the details of what transpired over the last 2 years in Gaza, but for many that sort of encapsulated and demonstrates that the Western world was not necessarily as vocal about protecting the rights of innocent civilians in Gaza, despite the horror of what Hamas committed, despite whether or not Israel has the right to defend itself. Did it have the right to prolong this 2 years of devastation on innocent civilians in Gaza, right? So this is something, this is an ongoing debate right now about to what extent is the West willing to apply the norms of human rights and democracy when it comes to the citizens of the region? To what extent is this, again, this sometimes underlying Islamophobia shaping policies towards the region? And so the idea about democracy promotion is about almost democratic rehabilitation, right? We need to make sure we have the right citizens with the right values in place before we can even talk about the procedural components of democracy. Hence my book of Empires and Citizens, Pro-American Democracy or No Democracy at All. We need to make sure that if we have democracy in the region, it's going to yield outcomes that are going to be beneficial to this geostrategic environment that we live in today. And what does that mean, Henry, more specifically? As long as you have interests on the ground that are not pro-American, then there's going to be hesitancy about full-heartedly supporting democracy promotion. So what has democracy promotion looked like in the region over the last 2-3 decades is like, well, let's stay away from the big picture issues, elections, accountability, rotation of power, representation, rule of law, combating corruption. Almost every, there's corruption in almost every regime that has across the region. So let's not touch that because we don't want to destabilize the region. And let's focus on the soft power issues or the issues that we can influence, maybe youth civic engagement, skill building, women's rights, things that will not destabilize the region on the margins. And that's where U.S. democracy promotion has focused. Now, having said that, is this a call to end U.S. or Western democracy promotion? Absolutely not. I still think the region is better off with those empowerment mechanisms and those engagement mechanisms. But we need to be very careful about what we're calling that writ large.
That's a very good answer, Dr. Jamal, because it takes me to my next questions about exactly what's going on in the Middle East right now as we're speaking. So, Professor Jamal, as you are probably aware, everyone is right now in talking about Tunisia and the politics in Tunisia, right? There is a serious signals of democratic backsliding that we all are witnessing in Tunisia, a global recessions. And Tunisia was one of those countries that was celebrated as a successful model of a democratic transitions in the Middle East after the Arab Springs. My question is more, how do you assess the current state of democracy in the Middle East compared to when you begin the work on the Arab Barometer and we started collecting the data when the Arab Spring started? Are we seeing a regional patterns that mirror the global trends? Because also, to be honest with you, there is also like a democratic backsliding happening in Europe, right? In Western European economies. And so my question is, are we really seeing this kind of a regional patterns that mirror the global trends, or are we there's something distinct about the challenges that the MENA is experiencing?
Right. So this is a great question also, Dania. So on Tunisia, really quickly, Tunisia was our poster child success democratic story, right? Remember, for decades, we were in conferences and workshops and conversations, and oftentimes as scholars and analysts of the region, what we're confronted with repeatedly is, let's just, if we're even ignoring the geostrategic climate, is, well, the Middle East has yet to see the Arab world has yet to see its own democracy, and it's basically the whole world has moved towards democracy, but not the Arab world. And then lo and behold, we get the Arab Spring. Egypt's democratic experiment, failed. Tunisia succeeded, and that was our poster. And again, it gave those of us who support true democracy in the region so much hope, and it being the model of democracy. And for their part, if you look at what happened and transpired in Tunisia, in terms of civil society coming together, trying to sort of build consensus, work towards parliamentary elections, representation, rights, women's rights, political rights. For a decade, Tunisia was really pushing very strong in remarkable ways, right? Every other democracy that's transitioned has taken decades to build where Tunisia was going within the matter of 1 decade. So it tells us that on the ground, the ingredients of a strong democratic civil society were in place. But what we also know, Dania and Henry, from all the studies done on democracy in the world, historically, the evolution of democracy, the consolidation of democracy, the entrenchment of democracy, we also know that the strongest correlation with democracy out there is that democracies correlate well with economic growth and development.
Sure.
And going back to the Democracy Promotion Project, the Democracy Promotion Project in Tunisia remained static. It remained as if it was still dealing with an authoritarian setting where they did not want to destabilize. They wanted to focus on the soft topics like women's rights and youth engagement. So the investments remained meager and not sufficient to think about critically supporting this country on its economic progress. So what happens in the decade of democracy? The average citizen, despite all the democratic political gains, the average citizen in real per capita terms was earning more on the eve of Ben Ali's collapse than 10 years after the democratic experiment. And so where the West, I think, and again, it's not like I'm putting this big burden on the West and it's the West's responsibility to build democracy in Tunisia. But if the West is always calling out the region for not being democratic, and if only they were democratic, things would be different. And if only they could show democracy, oh, lo and behold, those citizens would be different. For the fact that you did not then step in to help Tunisia on an economic development project, right? But when countries are in debt, you bring in the IMF and you put them on austerity measures and you have policies in place. When countries are about to thrive democratically, you need to also come in and make sure that you are a partner in that democratic success. So when the average citizen is earning less, 10 years after Ben Ali, of course, they're going to begin to question the foundations of democracies and the utility of democracy and the benefits of democracy. So that's when populism becomes very, very attractive. Hence Kais Saied and his popularity and the reversion of democracy in Tunisia. But this was also happening within a global context where there was also democratic backsliding, also because because our in Western democracies especially, our democracies are becoming more unequal economically. The rich are becoming richer, poor are becoming poorer. That's something that we're not talking about. I mean, we talk about it enough, but I don't think enough is being done about it. So then with all of these ingredients and the rise of populism and democratic backsliding, it does not look well for the region. And to the last point, Dania, if we look at Arab Barometer data, what we're seeing is that support for democracy is still high, but the percent of people that believe that democracy helps economically or democracy is good for the economy is on the decline. And so this, remember, right, now we're also in a global context where you have these authoritarian powers like China and Russia who are able to sort of, sell what's called sort of like modern authoritarianism and prosperous authoritarianism and capitalist authoritarianism, right? Where you have vibrant middle classes growing, people are being lifted out of poverty. These countries are offering amenities and attractions and comforts that they were not able to supply 20 years ago. And so the average citizen is seeing that, wow, under authoritarianism, there might be better economic success than under democracy. And then to your point, on the same time period, when we were talking about the average citizen in Tunisia earning less a decade after democracy, the average citizen in China from 2000 to 2020 to, I believe it's 2020 or 2010, but basically the average Chinese income has increased 12-fold over the last 2 decades. So under this authoritarian model. So it's a different global climate. There was once this global climate of democracy and economic prosperity in one bundle, authoritarianism and poverty in the other. If we need to pull all these countries to democracy, that world order is now being challenged.
This is very important because one of the recent reports from the Arab Barometer is actually people saying that we define democracy by their ability to deliver public services. This is one of the findings that was published recently from the Arab Barometer, exactly to what you're mentioning. I think Henry has a question about that.
Yeah, that is fascinating. And I love that you bring up the individual citizens. And that brings me to this next question about democratic aspirations in the individual, especially in the youth. So one striking finding of the Arab Barometer surveys has been this persistent democratic aspirations among Arab publics. I think you just referenced that. And even as their trust in democratic institutions has eroded. So how do you interpret the apparent contradiction, and particularly given a youth demographic in the region? What are you seeing in terms of younger generations' view of democracy, governance, and political participation different from these older generations?
So the younger generation is much more plugged into sort of these like universal democratic norms of representation, right? So again, this idea that the youth are socialized to detest or not appreciate democracy is just not founded in any of our surveys, right? The youth, like any other global youth, are in favor of democracy, but primarily they want to be able to live a life of economic dignity and sustenance, where their skill set, where they, the Middle East, if you look at the gap in terms of education, right? The percent of citizens getting college degrees has been astronomical over the last 3 decades. This is a remarkable story for the Arab world. The Arab world has a very highly educated youth population. The problem is job markets domestically are not matched to meet the skill set of students. So they're not getting suitable jobs domestically. As you can see, the immigration story is now much more hotly contested. Factor in conflict, right? This is a region that's seen devastation and conflict, whether it was Iraq, whether it was Syria, whether it's Gaza. These all have reverberating consequences. The Arab Spring was very destabilizing in many countries. All of these factors don't bode well for economic development and job creation. So, in our conversations with ordinary youth, they're like, of course I would love democracy, but if an authoritarian leader can give me a job, I'll take that as well. I mean, these kids want to grow up, they want to get married, they want to be able to have families, they want to be able to pay their rent, they don't want to live with their parents and their cousins and their aunts and uncles forever. So these kids and our youth, they want a future like all other future youth in the world. And it's and unfortunately, the economic realities of the region are not keeping up with the aspirations of the youth, which also then creates a problem. Furthermore, the youth bulge in the Middle East is very large. The Arab Middle East is a very young population. And so something has to give in terms of job creation, opportunities. Immigration now is under attack. So this is all going to place a lot of pressure on some of these domestic regimes moving forward.
That's very interesting. That's actually my dissertation. I'm actually looking at how remittances from youth coming actually shape the political attitude and the political behaviors of the people in the country, their family who stay there. So this is a very interesting conclusion for like the related to my also dissertation work.
It's very fascinating, right? Because we don't study remittances enough. So congratulations. But remittances is a huge part of economic viability in the region. And so when the idea of limiting immigration as if it's just like an anti-immigrant sentiment, it's really the structural effects of that are far more consequential.
Totally.
I also must say I've been looking at remittances and their effect on the Mexican economy for a little bit of research I've been doing there. And it's also fascinating, completely different region of the world, the effects of immigration and crackdowns from a more developed country.
And you see these structural influences hitting back at domestic economies.
Completely. Yes. I thank you for that answer on the youth. And I'd love to touch on something we were talking about earlier when you were talking about the West and democracy promotion coming from the West. I'd love to touch upon where should democracy promotion come from? Given your research in the Middle East, as well as your field work and work with policy professionals in the region, how do you think democracy promotion should proceed in the Middle East? In what contexts and in what conditions should the promotion of democracy occur? Through an external/foreign actor, whether this means foreign government, foreign international organizations, or do you think the promotion should happen internally from within the system, including local organizations, individuals, or actors?
So this is something I spent a lot of time thinking about it, right? So let's all agree that, democracy is a normative outcome that is good for the world, is good for the Middle East, is good for the West, is good for everybody. There was a time and place where we would be at conferences and we would say, everybody in the room will converge that the ideal point is democracy, right? I think now there's all these qualifications and adjectives and this, that, and the other. But let's go back to that world order where, all things equal, the world would be better off if it was all democratic, including the Arab world, right? So where do we start? One is this is not a foreign topic to the citizens of the region, right? You have a long history of democracy and democratic demands in the region. People are in jails across every country in the Arab region. People are in jail because they want more democracy, right? So it's not like there aren't domestic partners to find and work with. But democracy cannot be just unidimensional, right? Democracy is a holistic system of governance. So it can't be that we're only going to focus on this one specific topic at the exclusion of all these other topics. So for anybody working in the democracy promotion space, whether domestic or international, you need to understand the context of the world that you're operating in. Now, if democracy promotion becomes still an extension of the post-Cold War world, where you're either on the democratic side or on the post-communist side, right? And therefore, to be on the democratic side in a geostrategic sort of calculation that only serves the national interest of certain countries, then you need to be on the, you need to sort of then you need to be much more explicit about those goals, right? In other words, if national security interest or world security interest or geostrategic interest will always predominate and democracy will be secondary, then that has to be part of the conversation, right? Right. And so what do I mean by this, right? It could be that, for example, Western countries will only support democracy if it satisfies Western interests. And those Western interests need to be articulated. It can't be that, oh, we only care about democracy, when in fact we know that you're worried about democracy producing results. For example, let's be honest. Let's say you're promoting democracy and you bring to power groups and entities that are anti-American or anti-Europe or anti-West. Is that the kind of democracy promotion that you want to support? Mm-hmm. And if you're not going to support that, what are you doing to make sure the citizens of the region become less anti-American or anti-West, right? So the way we've dealt with this so far is that, no, let's promote democracy, but let's also impose civil and political liberty limitations to make sure we weed out those anti-American or anti-Western interests. So let's oppress while we promote democracy and figure out how to do that. And then let's nullify democracy and say it's not suitable for the region when it produces results we don't like. But let's still continue to promote democracy because we're committed to democracy. And if all that fails, let's just basically go to war or something. Right. That is not going to produce democracy. So let's take a different paradigm. Why don't we sit and ask ourselves, all of these countries are strategic allies of the United States. Most Arab countries are strategic allies of Western Europe. When we poll the citizens and the youth of the region, they all want stronger ties to the US and Europe, but not in a way that is dismissive or disparaging, right? So it's not like what people have tried to peddle and sell to the public, again, which is like very Islamophobic and essentialist, which is that Arabs and Muslims will always hate the West and Europe because Arabs and Muslims are always going to be anti-Western. And this is still being peddled by politicians in the United States, and in Europe. So despite all the public opinion data, we have now 8 waves of Arab Barometer data from 2006 till today. That's 20 years of data, over 100,000 interviews across different time periods and spaces, showing that this narrative is not substantiated in our polls. And people will still say, well, you know, Muslims and Arabs and Muslims and Arabs and Muslims and Arabs. And, you know, at some point you just got to say, cut it out. So then you need to ask yourself, but if there is anti-Americanism or anti-Western sentiment, what is it about? Is it about your values, when we have shown repeatedly that Arabs will embrace the values of democracy, of tolerance, of representation, even, you know, support for women's rights? Yes, maybe they don't match the West, but we see upwards trajectories. all these quote unquote transformations have happened. But what has not happened? U.S. strategic interests still basically prioritize things like oil, stability over democracy. The U.S. Western policies are seen as inconsistent, are seen not only as inconsistent, but don't live up to their own values when it comes to the human rights and basic rights of citizens in the Arab world. It seems that there's always narratives about rights and human rights that apply for Western societies that are denied to Muslims and Arabs, and the rhetoric coming out of even media, politics. So all of this, right? So maybe the West also, if it wants to be sincerely involved in democracy promotion, needs to first take a look at itself in the mirror and say, how do we combat our own sort of essentialist stereotypes about these people? And instead of, because then democracy promotion becomes a way of funding activities that are just about your own stereotypes and not about the welfare of democracy in the region or the citizens, how the citizens have been working towards democracy in the region. And the word I was looking for is that when the Western world has like double standards when it comes to Arabs and Muslims as well.
Right. That's a very good point also, because you don't want to create a one-fit-all strategy. You don't want to create one system of American democracy and just put it and implement it. You have to understand what the people want and what the people actually perceive democracy is. Go back to the people.
Right, and then just want to make sure that it's not that the Arab world have this very sophisticated, convoluted, circuitous, incomprehensible understanding of democracy. It's very basic. The average citizen wants to be represented, does not want to be oppressed, wants to be able to find a job, wants to be able to support their family, and not fear speaking in public, not fear being picked up because they criticize the regime. It's very basic in terms of what the citizens want.
Right. Dr. Jamal, we're a little bit over time, but we have two questions if you have some time left.
Yes, please.
Thank you. I want to just hear your thoughts about our reports first. So what do you think about it? Any comments, any feedback that we can make? And then the next question is more about the framework that Henry and I worked on it this past summer. So the idea behind that framework is really kind of measuring trust instead of looking at trust in general, like the political trust concept that we study in the literature, more looking at trust through the different political institutions. So civil society and government, and try to unpack why we have variations across these institutions to provide a better kind of predictive power for the political outcomes that might come, instead of just looking at a holistic understanding of political trust in general. So I just want to know what you think about that frameworks, anything that we can make it better. And then the other question is also, I know you've done a lot of work on political participation in the regions. And so do you think these variations and these distinctions between trust across the institutional level resonates with what you have observed in terms of like the actual participation patterns and how people really study and perceive these institutions?
So this is great. First of all, congratulations on the report and taking on such an important topic like political trust. And the way you do it, I really am a big fan of analytically creating these categories that really sort of differentiate the different institutions, right? So oftentimes what happens with these political trust scores is that they're sort of, like you said, summarized or a factor analysis or a Crumbach alpha is imposed on them, and then they're one like dimension in terms of thinking about this. I mean, the fact that, you break this down and you really look at security, you look at the military, and support for the military as a very strong predictive measure of support for authoritarianism, I think is very insightful. And remember, I mean, and you're creating some nuance, right? Because even what you're saying is that, yes, support for trust and the military translates into support for authoritarianism, but you can also interlay that over some support for democracy. Yeah. And meaning what I'm trying to say is like getting back to the conversation, right? Are citizens blindly following the military and authoritarianism because they're like hawkish and they believe in military rule? Or are they sort of embracing this as a means of political stability, which you talk about a lot in your report, right? And so, and this is really, really important. And to your point about understanding the terms of the context in terms of what's shaping or informing how citizens think about these issues, right? Again, because this region has seen enormous political instability over the last 2-3 decades, right? The average citizen does not want to be involved in war, does not want their country to have to deal with the economic, not only the disaster of war, but the economic devastation that comes from war. So having trust in your military, having trust in the security establishment, and even if it means authoritarianism, is also a way of guaranteeing everyday well-being for you and your family, right? And I think your report is really getting us much closer to understanding the contextual realities that are informing how we interpret and understand these measures in a way that hasn't been done well when we're looking at these sort of like, big picture trust measures, because trust means this. In one country in the West, it should mean the same thing in the region, and that's not the case. And what your report does very well and quite eloquently and insightfully is really begin to sort of contextualize what these parameters mean in the context of the region.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Exactly. This is kind of the thing that we were trying to understand. Is like we need to kind of step in and understand why we have variation in trust, why people trust civil society but do not trust the government. So, or trust the military but do not trust the government. In the case of Tunisia, it was thanks for the military that we had a regime change. In case of Egypt, the military kind of stepped in against the dictatorship and, did what they did. So sometimes trust in the military can signal a regime change. It depends on the context.
Yes. Touching on this in our report again, I wanted to bring up, again, something you brought up earlier, your book, Barriers to Democracy, where you explore the role of civic associations in promoting democratic efforts in the Arab world. Throughout our research, we discovered positives and negatives to using individual civil society organizations or institutions, and we surmised that strengthening certain combinations of civil society organizations, institutions, or government institutions with them based on a country's overall trust profile creates the strongest democratic outcome. Throughout your research, what positives and negatives have you identified with strengthening individual civil society organizations versus combinations?
Right. So this is a very good question, Henry, and I'm very much in favor of looking at, quote unquote, what you're calling combinations, but like combinations of what dimensions, for example. So again, getting back to understanding your context and understanding the civil society lay of the land is extremely important if you're trying to empower actors that are supportive of democracy. Because in Barriers to Democracy, what I found is that civil society, and at least the combinations that I created in the book, was basically bifurcated along a binary of, and yes, I imposed like this binary, but more or less that there was pro-government civil society, which is very common in authoritarian regimes, and there was anti-government civil society, or what I call pro-democracy civil society in my book, right? And so if you're an outside funder, and both these civil society groups are doing the same thing, right? They're advocating for, training people to become more, better stewards of representative governments, whether it's women's rights, whether it's youth activities, and you're funding both of them, you're funding authoritarianism if that money is going to pro-government civil society. You're funding, right, pro-democracy civil society if they're criticizing the regime, right? These combinations are very, very important. I also do believe, and I tackle this sort of indirectly in my first book, which is that thematically, let's say we're dealing with women's rights organizations, oftentimes foreign donors will identify like a glitzy, glamorous organization that where, all its members speak English, the executive board has already traveled to Europe and whatnot. And that's great. And I'm not diminishing the wonderful work being done by what I call the more prestigious sort of civil society organizations, but a lot of work a lot of work is being done at the very local levels, like in the villages, in the towns, with what's often termed as charitable societies in the Arab world. And these are the charitable societies that are redistributing, they're empowering women, they're conducting literacy programs, they're making sure youth get jobs. They're holding their local village councils accountable if they're not being more redistributive and democratic. And these local charitable societies get very little attention from external donors. And so it also creates this other sort of binary and division between the haves and the have-nots in the democracy promotion space. But that is, I can go on and on about the different sort of dynamics on the ground in the region around democracy promotion and civil society.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Well, it's been a real pleasure to be with you. Thank you for your ongoing work, and I wish you much success.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jamal. Thank you so much. We appreciate it. Thank you so much.